First off, start by apologising slightly if I'm a bit dishevelled looking. My luggage is somewhere still in Amsterdam. So I hope it will arrive today and I'll be able to get a change of shirt and brush my hair, but until then. Okay, but you're not here to talk about or to hear a talk about my problems with Air France, but to hear a talk about SPL, Standard PHP Library. Who here actually uses parts of the standard PHP library at all? Oh, good, a few of you. How many of you have upgraded to PHP7 already? Good number of hands still going up. SPL was introduced back in the days of, well, PHP 5.0, where it was a PECL extension for PHP. It became part of core PHP in PHP 5.3, and at that time it provided a whole collection of different pieces of functionality that were incredibly useful. But PHP itself, example of some of the functionality that's produced there, but PHP has moved on since then. PHP7 has reworked a whole host of things. It's added, well, with PHP 5.5 we got generators, improved even more in PHP7. We've got reworking of the way arrays were designed and handled internally, which mean that you can write a lot of things using arrays now much more efficiently, both in terms of memory usage and performance, whereas SPL functionality remains unchanged. A lot of the benefits that SPL gave you are no longer really benefits. So I use SPL quite extensively in a whole host of things. I decided that I was going to take a look and see what benefit it did actually give me still with PHP 7. Examples of some of the things. I noticed not everyone raised their hand when asked if they used SPL. One of the core elements of SPL is SPL Autoloader, which I hope everybody uses in one form or another, even if it's just via Composer. So everybody in here actually does use SPL in one form or another, I hope. If you're still including all your files, then I'd recommend moving to Composer. Okay, let's take a look at one or two of the different things that SPL does actually give us and see if they are still relevant. Not the best slide there to represent data types, but it was the best I could come up with a commercial commons license, a CC license picture for data types, all string types there. Unfortunately, we've not got any numerics, but SPL does provide data types. Nice object wrappers around all your basic scalars like integer, float, string, bool, and a magic enum as well, which is actually still just about useful. But this has never been anything other than experimental. It's not actually part of core PHP. It's still a PECL extension, even though it's under the SPL banner, and it was originally written to provide scalar type hinting within PHP. You've got scalar type hinting within PHP now, which for all its faults is still a lot better than SPL's data types. SPL data type, you create an object, an SPL int, containing the integer value, but you can't use it to do arithmetic or, well, certainly not calling functions like log or sin or any of the other things without converting it back to an integer. So its only real value was for type hinting. You can do that anyway now with PHP 7. I hope a lot of you are beginning to do so because it's a great little feature. I have to say SPL type hints probably should best fall by the wayside. They should be forgotten. I mentioned the autoloader. I'm not sure what port that is. Looks like a Danish one from the road sign, perhaps. SPL autoloader, as I say, if you're using Composer or you're using FARS, you're using SPL autoloader. And that is kind of critical to the modern PHP infrastructure. Is a part of SPL that's pretty much transparent to what you do, really, if you're using Composer, but it's absolutely essential. If you want to use it yourself, write your own autoloader, it's still pretty useful. I've got a couple of libraries I use which people don't necessarily use Composer still, but still want to use the library, so I provide a bootstrap loader for them using SPL autoloader. So that's a critical part of SPL that has to remain, is still 100% useful. We wouldn't want to get rid of it. So one reject from SPL, not much use. One absolutely essential. Let's look at some of the more interesting components. This is a toolkit to represent the interfaces, which provide you with some nice functionality if you want to write a lot of your own iterators, etc., etc., other than those already provided by SPL. It provides interfaces for countable, various iterator types, outer iterator. My apologies for that. It's very difficult when you're talking about iterators in SPL. It's kind of a drinking game because you've got recursive iterator, and a million and one other iterators. So if you take a drink every time you say iterator when talking about SPL iterators, you'd get very drunk very, very quickly, and your tongue would be twisting around even more than mine is. But the interfaces provide a handful of basic interfaces and one design pattern interface for SPL Observer, which can be quite useful, but a lot of frameworks and libraries now provide that functionality for you. You can hook events into objects. Laravel does it, Symfony does it, Zen Framework does it. If you're using any of those, you don't need to worry about writing your own interfaces for observer pattern or anything like that. These interfaces, though, are literally just signatures. You still have to implement the functionality yourself in code if you are going to use them. What they are is a backbone for iterators, and we get into the real iterator drinking game here. SPL's iterators are much more fun. They provide means for working with various types of collections and arrays. There are file iterators and recursive file and recursive directory iterators. There is even, and I can't find any documentation for it, but it does exist in the core code, an XML iterator. I've never actually used it. Has anyone actually found that one before, of those using SPL? No? Worth a look at if you are prepared to delve into the PHP source code, because as I say, I can't find any documentation for it. I ended up writing my own ages ago, and if I'd known that SPL actually provided an XML iterator, I'd have taken a closer look at it. You also have filter iterators like the regexp iterator, so that you can actually pass that to a file iterator to run a regexp or multiple regexps against the files that you return via your file iterator. I'm talking too quickly here, aren't I, when I'm talking about iterators? Allowing you to be more selective in what is returned. And my favorite is the multiple iterator, which allows you to iterate multiple iterators at the same time, which is, believe it or not, quite common requested question on Stack Overflow, and something that it's incredibly useful to do. And if you're doing it using normal arrays, you have to ensure that the keys match up and everything like that, otherwise it'll break. Sorry about that. But SPL's multiple iterator actually gives you various flags to define its behavior in various circumstances when it doesn't find matching keys, so that you can actually say ignore mismatches and only return those elements from the iterable objects that actually have a matching key, or stop iterating when you find the first mismatch of keys, behavior like that. That's actually an incredibly useful, incredibly simple way of combining multiple arrays together. And if you're into the mathematics of it, you can actually use it for little things like array transforms and other clever tricks. But PHP 5.5 gave us generators. Everything we can do with an iterator, even SPL's built-in iterators, we can probably write more simply using a generator. So why do we want to use iterators still? We can write our own now with generators. All we do is create a function with the yield keyword. So I took a basic iterator. I know code is hard to read on slides. I'm not expecting you to read this. If you really do want to read it, the slides will be available online, and I'll ping out a URL for them on SlideShare. But what is important to notice, this is basically an iterator that just recursively iterates through a series of folders returning all image files. You can just about read the code written using SPL's iterators. If you can read that, I'll be amazed. That is the same code, but rewritten to use a generator. So the first point to note, even if you can't read it, is that writing your own code using generators to achieve that objective, it takes a lot more userland code. You've got to write more lines of code just to achieve the same basic thing. SPL, you can still do it much more simplistically, fewer lines of code, fewer lines of your code that need testing. So in that regard, SPL is still relevant. Yes, you can do the same thing now using generators, but you've got a lot more work to do and a lot more tests to write to achieve that objective. However, that was a pro for iterators. Less code, less testing. The con is performance. Running that code using a generator, it's faster and ever so fractionally more memory efficient even. So you've got to trade off. Do you want the performance or do you want the code readability? Do you want to write 50 lines of code instead of 20? Okay, pretty much sums it up. Less userland code if you're using SPL's iterators, but potentially slower. In my case, it was slower. Potentially less memory efficient than generators. That one's borderline. There's not much in it. Generators have the edge overall in performance if you're prepared to write yourself or you create libraries to do these tasks for you. But there's a couple of things you can't do with generators that you can with iterators. I've listed two of them there. You can extend any of SPL's iterators, add your own code, overload the iterators' methods. Generators are final. So you can't extend a generator. You can't add anything new to it. It is literally just the code you implement. Second thing, you can't rewind a generator. You can rewind an iterator. So depending on what exactly you want to do, if you're searching for something and you want to repeat that multiple times, using an iterator is much better because you can just rewind it and search for the next item in the list. Yeah, you can get around that type of thing by writing filters and various other techniques, but being unable to rewind a generator is a bit of a drawback still, I find, and it would be nice if at some point some method could be provided to allow you to either do a rewind or to make a generator non-final, but somehow I don't think that's possible with the way they're implemented. There is a third one, which I haven't listed on there, and I probably should add to the slides. You can't serialize a generator. You can serialize an iterator. You might have to write a bit of custom sleep and wake up code to do so if you're using resources like directory handles or similar. But if you wanted to paginate a directory display or a file display, in the case of a generator, you have to write all the code to handle that yourself outside of the generator, whereas with an extended iterator, you could write rewind logic, you could write seek logic, that type of thing, all nicely built in. It can be serialized, next request, you show the second page. So iterators there do still have some real benefits. I know you French like your rugby. We English like our rugby as well. I've no idea who the teams are. Again, it's a Collective Commons license for usage of that. But I'm a big fan of rugby and tries and catches, and that's why that's the picture for exceptions. SPL provides a whole host of exceptions. Some of them rather dubiously named, difficult to work out exactly what the difference is between an out-of-bounds exception and an out-of-range exception. There's no clear guidance on when to use each one, but they do exist. They even have a little extension hierarchy. So all of them extend exception, but then you get logic exceptions, so you can catch based on logic exception. We'll pick up bad function call exceptions, bad method call exceptions, domain exceptions, etc. So quite nice to use in your code. But they don't provide anything new. All they do is extend exception and have a fancy name. You can write your own extensions that do that in one declaration line. So to be honest, I think the extensions themselves are a little bit overrated. You can use them, you can not use them. They don't add much difference to your code. All they are is name things that can be caught. And you can write those anyway and give them meanings that are significant to your applications, your code logic. One of my favorite topics. Last time I was speaking on SPL, it was very specifically about SPL data structures. And that's exactly what that picture's meant to represent. And I'm a cat owner, so I always try to get cats in any of my talks. I've actually managed to squeeze 2 into this one, but there's the first. SPL data structures. We have a whole host of different data structures within SPL. Fixed array, double linked lists, stacks, queues, heaps, object storage, priority queue, the type of thing that anyone that might have taken computer science at university should be familiar with. If you're not, I would strongly recommend data structures. They might seem esoteric, ivory tower science, computer science type things, but in the right circumstances, used in the right way, they can really, really simplify your code, make it very efficient. They've evolved over the time when people have discovered a common need to achieve particular data objectives very, very simply. Stacks are used and queues are used extensively internally. Every function call that your code writes data to an internal PHP stack, a call stack, so that it knows where to go back after it's finished that call. So data science does sometimes get things right, and in this particular case, let's look at some of them. Fixed array. PHP's arrays are wonderfully flexible tools. You can extend them, you can add to them, you can use associative or enumerated indexes to them. But in PHP5, they weren't particularly efficient, particularly in terms of memory usage. Nikita Popov, Nikki C, on Twitter, wrote a very detailed blog post about the amount of memory that a PHP array would actually use. Storing data in PHP arrays is not cheap if you're low on or short on memory. Large volumes of data particularly become very expensive to store, but the arrays are incredibly flexible, so you want to be able to use them, you want to be able to iterate over that data. So SPL provided the fixed array. Fixed array, you define exactly how big it's going to be in advance. It's enumerated only, starting with 0, working upwards. And a few simple tests here using PHP5. The equivalent memory usage of a standard PHP array compared to a fixed array. If you can work with fixed sizes of data, if you know how many records you're going to be returning from a database that you want to put into an array, and a simple result count will tell you that. If you're working with days of the year, based on the year, it's either 365 or 366, you know how many values you're going to be working with. If you're doing an airline booking system, you know how many seats there are in an aircraft in advance, or a hotel booking system. You can use fixed arrays for that. And the memory savings with PHP5 were really quite incredible. I think that was 100,000 integer elements that I was storing here, 64-bit integer. And it's a third of the amount of memory if you use a fixed array. And performance-wise, populating the array was much more efficient as well, just churning through the data, adding it to the array. Retrieval times not so good, but if you can live with the time variations there, the memory saving was worth it with PHP5. However, with PHP7, PHP7's memory handling for arrays is now much more efficient. PHP7, you can do exactly the same using a standard PHP array in half the memory that SPL fixed array did it in PHP 5.5. SPL fixed array is still less memory, but it's a much smaller margin. And there are drawbacks to using fixed array, particularly if you're not assigned values to elements. You have to have additional code to handle what if the value isn't set. It's a lot less forgiving than a standard PHP array for that. But in some cases, yes, if you know what you're working with, using a fixed array is still beneficial. You still get the memory saving, but your time savings have gone out the window completely. PHP7 is so much faster when working with its own standard arrays that while you've got the memory benefit, you've no longer got the timing benefits that a fixed array gave you. So that's a judgment call as to whether it's better or worse. Looking at something like a doubly linked list, we get, in fact, quite a lot worse with PHP7 using the SPL doubly linked list compared to just working with a normal PHP array, which you can traverse forward or backward anyway. So if you're using SPL doubly linked lists specifically, there's probably no benefit with using it. In fact, it's a lot worse now in PHP7 compared to standard array. But doubly linked lists form the basis for stacks and queues. So if we take a look at a stack, a homebrew stack, much more efficient using SPL stack in 5.6. With PHP7, it's slightly more performant, slightly less memory efficient for some weird reason. I can't fathom that one out. I would have expected still to get some memory benefit using SPL stack, just a much less benefit. But again, it's very much a judgment call if you still want to use SPL stack these days. SPL queues compared to a normal queue, there is a big gotcha with popping data off a queue if you've written it using an array. And the fact that's because the entire array needs re-indexing after you take something from the bottom. Hence the rather marked difference between the push and pop times for a standard PHP implementation of a queue compared to SPL queue. So if you're using queues, I'd still recommend the SPL one there. Heap, again, similar timings, not an enormous amount of benefit these days to using the SPL version compared to a homebrew version of a heap. Caveat now, if you are into using your data structures and have been using SPL's data structures in the past, I'd recommend taking a look at an external library. It's a PECL library written by Rudy Thunison and Joe Watkins, Crack Joe for those who know the internals team. A set of data structures written very specifically for PHP7. You can find the repo on GitHub, and Rudy has blogged quite extensively there about the data structures that he's written. SPL's data structures were never efficiently written. They were still pretty good back in the days of PHP 5.3 compared to homebrew in userland code. These have been written very specifically for PHP7. They've been written properly and cleanly, and you can look at the code to see just how useful they are. And Rudy provides some of the same data structures, plus a handful of different ones. The one thing I'm sorry, he doesn't provide any tree-based data structures at all. But a quick look at something like the stack. I've taken my original figures and then same code using Rudy's stack. Performance-wise, about the same as the SPL stack, but the memory saving is there again. Similarly for Q, so you can see that they're slightly more cleanly written just by the fact that they're more efficient memory-wise. Performance-wise, they still have the benefits, and they are still more beneficial than writing the same code yourself. So if you do have to use data structures, I'd recommend using Rudy's, even though it's still a PECL extension. Some point I hope that it might become a core part of PHP and replace SPL's data structures where it's justified to do so. The fact that he provides nice things like double-ended queues in addition to the standard ones is an added benefit for those who like their data structures. Files. For those who like working with object-oriented code, well, PHP provides a lot of functions for working with files, but there is a very nice set of SPL object wrappers for those functions that allow you to write all your file handling code in an OO style, and which do provide one or two additional benefits as well, particularly when working with things like comma-separated value files, where if you've got a blank line and you're writing it yourself, your code has to take that into account, whereas the SPL file handling objects, you can actually tell it to ignore blank lines, that type of thing. So there's a few little extra benefits in using the SPL file handling, plus it keeps all your nice OO code even more OO if you're using those OO wrappers. I don't know if you have these in France. That's similar to a picture of a Woolworths pick-a-mix, where you can just get whatever sweets you want. They're all the same price, so you can just pick everything. It's kind of a collection of everything under the sun. But there are a number of standard functions within SPL that can be quite useful. Loosely categorized, there's two types. There's class functions, which give you some additional ways of looking at your classes. For example, you can check what traits are being used by a particular class. Now, back in the days when this was first written, there was what was called reflection in PHP, which was bloody awful to use. It was very expensive time-wise. SPL provided these much more efficiently. But reflection has improved. Reflection is a lot faster now. I said I'd get a second cat in here, and I couldn't resist that picture. PHP's reflection, even in the later PHP5, was much more efficient, and I'd strongly recommend using that, not just because it provides all your functionality within one reflection library, but because it is more efficient now than using those few functions that SPL did provide. It also provides a set of iterator functions. Iterator apply is effectively an array map against an iterable object. You can do that with generators now and all kinds of other things. Iterator count the elements in an iterator, or convert it to an array so that you can use your standard array functions. All those were provided, but one thing with generators, don't try doing an iterator count on an infinite generator. You can write a generator that simply returns a random number when called or something like that. It's infinite. It never stops. It'll keep yielding until your script terminates or you stop calling it. You try doing an iterator count on that, it will try and work it out. It'll run out of numbers long before it succeeds, or it'll time out your script. So actually those functions are rather dangerous to use unless you know exactly what you're working with. And there are better alternatives to them. Okay, so short summary of what I've said. Data types, don't bother with them. Autoloader, absolutely essential to everything we do, even if you're not using it directly but only using it through Composer. Interfaces and iterators, case-by-case basis. They might be better for you, they might not. It's really something that you have to judge for yourself based on your own circumstances. Exceptions, forget them. You can provide everything they provide in one line yourself. Data structures, again, very much a case-by-case basis, depending on exactly what you need to do. But if you are using data structures, look at Rudy's set. They can give you a lot of very real benefits back in terms of memory, at the very least, even if their performance is pretty similar. File handling, I love OO file handling. It's great. That's part of SPL that should always remain. It just makes your code a heck of a lot cleaner and more consistent using OO throughout. Miscellaneous functions, yeah, right, okay. If you have to use them, use them. Use reflection though for consistency, as an alternative to the class functions, because reflection gives you so much more additional information about the classes you're working with if you need it. And the iterator functions, risky, occasionally useful, but generally there's a better way of doing what you would do using those functions. And I think my time is about now. Any questions, anybody? I know that was a very quick rattle through of SPL and some comparisons with PHP7, but oh, good grief. Either you've all gone to sleep first thing in the morning, which I can't believe because it's the very first morning of the conference, or I explained everything and you understood it perfectly. Oh, we have a question.
Yeah. So I heard that you are the maintainer of PHP Office. That's right.
That's
Do you
right.
use SPL in this library?
There is some SPL usage in there, yes. I did initially actually use SPL stack for the calculation engine stack, but discovered one minor problem in that SPL stack doesn't provide a nice clean peek method, which I did need to be able to retrieve the number of arguments passed to a function, which is a variable. It's not a constant for Excel functions. A lot of them accept multiple numbers of arguments. So that was discarded, but was originally used. SPL is or has been used as well for things like CSV file reader, although it again has been replaced with a custom reader that doesn't use fget CSV either. It actually parses the CSV itself. And for the newest version of it, PHP spreadsheet, I'm looking at using SPL file functions for writing CSV files again, because it's just cleaner code. The newest version of PHP Excel is PHP spreadsheet. We're renaming it. There are a couple of areas in PHP Word where we do use the data structures as well, if you delve into the code there. And to be honest, I'm looking at how they can be replaced in various ways, because they're no longer as performant as they were. What we can't do is guarantee that anyone using those libraries has got Rudy's DS library installed instead. So they're being rewritten with a very customized homebrew set of data structures. Use SPL where we can, but not where it's inappropriate. For things like parsing, I am delving into that undocumented XML iterator to see if there's any benefit to using that for the XML file formats, docx, XLSX, PPTX, etc. But I'll probably end up reworking those to use a generator instead to help with the memory issues when loading files.